GM, welcome to another episode of The Roll-Up. Today we are speaking with two projects that are innovating in the Bitcoin ecosystem. We're speaking with Rena from Stacks and Rich Rines of CoreDAO. These two projects are both pioneers in the Bitcoin scaling space. They have very similar and very different technical designs, as well as philosophies for how they build their projects. Please enjoy this episode. First, a word from our sponsors. Cartesia is your home for app-specific rollups. At the forefront of developing new tools and platforms that enhance the capabilities of blockchain technology, Cartesia enables applications that are flexible and built to scale. Build on a full Linux environment and use traditional software libraries, but in blockchain development. Go to cartesia.io, that's cartesia.io, to learn more about building your own app chain today.
Welcome back to the Roll-Up. Following our Bitcoin and Beyond series that we did a couple months back, we had the pleasure to meet up with Rena at Modular Summit and obviously Rich, a longtime joiner of the Roll-Up podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about a ton of the happenings in the Bitcoin ecosystem, some of the changes to the base layer, BitVM2 paper, the WBTC push, what Stacks and CoreDAO are doing. So a lot to cover. Rob, GM, let's get right into it.
Yeah, GM. Good to have friendly faces here. No, I'll keep it pretty brief. Like, Bitcoin and Beyond was super fun, learned a ton, and it's really cool that there's more activity happening on Bitcoin, both the chain and the protocol itself getting built. So, two leaders in that space here. Rena, good to meet you, and welcome to the channel.
GM.
And Rich, welcome back.
GM, great to be back.
Awesome. Well, I feel like this one's going to get pretty spicy. So, Rena, why don't you start? Give us the state of Bitcoin as you see it.
The Bitcoin state is evolving, and it's a little bit like ephemeral for like what side of Bitcoin you're on. There are Bitcoiners in the state of this is the best time to be in Bitcoin. We're growing, we're creative. There's new blood, new energy back into Bitcoin of, hey, we're actually using the chain. We're making transactions unlike a decade ago. And then you have the other side that is really sad that there are activity on Bitcoin and they just want to use it as money.
And that's what I'm trying to kind of understand, how you guys are thinking about this paradox of okay, so we've got some camps that are keep Bitcoin ossified, keep this hard money properties, keep this digital store of value. And then you've got the other camp that's well, guys, if we can't keep up with technological innovation, specifically at the base layer as well as scaling, then how are we going to even keep this network something that people want to use and keep value here? And so yeah, definitely curious to understand your perspectives on keeping Bitcoin immutable and a strong base layer, but also tweaking it a little bit to kind of keep it more competitive. What's the mental model that you both are approaching this current state with?
For me, it's pretty simple, but I think Bitcoin needs a few minor changes to kind of stay in the running game. If you think about it from this perspective, we only hit a billion transactions on Bitcoin this year in 2024, but you hit a billion transactions on Solana and ETH well before it existed. But Bitcoin is the longest running chain. If I think about going further, Bitcoin's going to continue to go through halving cycles. So mining subsidies are going to go down. So what is the incentive for miners to continue to run and operate the network? You need transaction activity. And without having some of these new meta protocols, no one was using Bitcoin for daily transaction activity. And that's what miners need to keep the incentive to continue to validate for the network. So I'm team, look, the base layer is great, but it could be a little bit better. So let's do a few subtle changes so that builders actually want to build dApps so that transaction activity occurs. Otherwise, in 20, like maybe 50, the mining subsidy is obsolete. So it is economically not incentive for people to mine.
So I think just to add on to Rena's point, which I largely agree with, I think we have a problem with the Bitcoin security budget probably in 8 years, like two halvenings from now. I'm actually really worried about it. And I'm pretty bearish that even if we get more meta protocols and that sort of thing, actually contributing to Bitcoin's transaction volume short term, that's enough. And I think this is where, exogenous block reward systems like merge mining or, core Satoshi Plus are actually super relevant, right? Because they're trying to help keep mining more profitable for the long term, which is so critical to keeping Bitcoin secure and decentralized. And that's why we're seeing folks like Marathon, et cetera, experiment mining with chains like Caspa, right? Like there's a lot of incentive to go figure out how to solve this problem. I do think it's a tightrope to walk, though, because Bitcoin, one of the reasons it has been so successful is because it is so simple. And that has always been a challenge with Bitcoin is how much innovation is okay. And I think we're seeing some of this with like the OPCAT, versus CTV debates right now, right? And I for one am like pretty ambivalent to seeing one of these get merged. And it's just that what timeline is that going to happen on, right? Is that 2 years? Is that 5 years? Like that sort of challenge is really hard. And I think this is also why these, other scaling solutions can be so critical to this story, because it can help while Bitcoin is figuring out what Bitcoin wants to be. But I do think there's a danger path here. And the danger path, I think, is losing a little bit of Bitcoin's narrative and also its potential to generate long-term transaction fees. A great example of this is Ethereum post 4844, right? Like if you look at Ethereum as a business after, these changes, it's actually significantly decreased. And Ethereum to some degree has lost its narrative. And like those are, existential problems, if it makes sense, but interesting things to chat about.
Do you think we're losing our Bitcoin narrative right now? Because I feel like we're redefining the Bitcoin narrative right now. When I think about what brought me into this industry like 10 years ago is I thought Bitcoin was money, like magical internet money. And that's what actually brought me in because I was a miner, literally a petroleum engineer. So straight up creating the energy used for mining at that point in time. You don't go more farm to table than that. But now when I think about Bitcoin, my relationship has changed that Bitcoin can be money, but Bitcoin can be something else. And I gravitate towards the kind of the narrative mind shift of Bitcoin might be the only chain that I can build on that truly is decentralized and has the ability to be fully permissionless. And I don't actually think other chains give me that level of comfort to experiment on like Bitcoin.
It's an interesting kind of hypothesis. I'm not sure that Bitcoin is losing its narrative. I'm more pointing that out as one possible eventuality that we could get into. And one of the reasons that, minimizing some of the changes to the base layer are likely a good idea. But I think we've actually already seen Bitcoin's narrative change many times, to your point, right? I remember in 2013, when I first got involved in Bitcoin, it was all about this uncensorable money. And I was so stoked to pay for Bitcoin to pay for coffee with Bitcoin, right? That was the coolest thing in the world, right? And since then, we've actually moved into, no, it's a store of value and the store of value, digital gold narrative. And I think it's important to, allow Bitcoin to be what Bitcoin wants to be. And we've already started to expand the Overton window over the last, let's call it 18 months with ordinals, BRC20s, runes. We've already started to see all those things shift. But I think it's important that Bitcoin remains this global settlement layer for high value transact. That is very critical to the story. And it's a little bit of playing devil's advocate, right? Where it's important to have as much activity as possible, but also to be aware of maybe some of the lessons that have come before us. You've heard a lot of the Ethereum is a Bitcoin testnet over the last, and I think it's true in some ways, right? We can, as Bitcoiners, take some of these learnings and then use it to lay our own path on a Bitcoin timescale.
It's if you want to do small value experiments, do it on any other chain. When you're ready to play with big money, you have to come to Bitcoin because there is no one who has the settlement and brand value like Bitcoin.
Ethereum as an L2 on Bitcoin is one, or a test net for Bitcoin is one of my favorite memes. When I first got into Bitcoin, it was like the verifiable money. I was excited to use money that I actually knew was there. Both my parents, they met at a bank that doesn't exist anymore, and both of them got laid off in the financial crisis. And so it was like when money's moving around and there's black swan events, it's like, well, where's the money? Bitcoin, you can actually see where the money is at all times. And, anyone can see it at any given time on the ledger. And so, yeah, I was really excited to use money that I knew was real because I could see it. I could almost touch it with my own hands in like this, not a tangible physical sense, but like I knew it was there. And so I think that narrative still exists today, but like whether or not we use that money to like reserve money and collateralize currencies that are a little bit easier to as a medium of exchange, or we actually use that Bitcoin on a daily basis to exchange, I was almost a little bit more detached from that. As long as I knew that the money was there, like to me that's what mattered.
I mean, that was actually one of the classic arguments for small blocks, right? Like if we go back to the block size war, right? The idea was that if you had really small blocks, it would be everyone in the world would practically be able to verify the chain. And that was always, one of like the straw man arguments as part of that story, if you will. But it is a really important property when we think about, blockchains generally is Bitcoin is max decentralization, right? And like that is part of its product market fit.
It always stands out to me like it's max decentralization. You know who some Bitcoin core devs are, but there's still no like governance foundation or CEO or anything that you can like necessarily point to. And that's the beauty of it will always be permissionless.
That might be changing though. Like
it's
banks.
It's also like the downfall of of these networks too. Ethereum's going through this like phase against Solana, where Solana's much more kind of top down oriented and gets things done and has these conferences and does these marketing things and has a much more cohesive feel. And Ethereum's kind of like all over this like this non-for-profit organization, and so Bitcoin's even almost like further down the line where it's almost like there's not a lot of leadership, if you will, and which is kind of like delaying some of these upgrades. And Rena, you were kind of hinting at a couple small tweaks or upgrades that you think that the base layer should consider, or that the community should be considering. And I think to put you on the spot, one in particular with regards to what Rich was saying was this increasing of the block size. I think that you have a take on that, or kind of perhaps a contrary view as well, based on these kind of verifiable properties. Maybe you could illuminate some of the changes and specifically onto your ideas behind the block size conversation.
I think we're fundamentally limited by the block sizes is like, yes, you have a limit and I understand like why we have it for security architecture and like incentives enough. But if people truly want to do something more with their Bitcoin and build complex dApps, DeFi protocols, things like that, or even go further on like the ordinal space of Bitcoin art could be the next Picasso or whatever it may be, or you want these like massively successful collections that increase value to the Bitcoin network because it is backed by BTC. I truly think that the block size could stand to have some improvements on increasement. And I think the challenge with like increasing the block space size is the kind of data and kind of complexity needed to maintain that from like a hash power perspective from the miners and such. Like we're already in a state where it is difficult to bring in new miners into Bitcoin because the rewards are diminishing return over time unless the value of Bitcoin goes up. And everyone knows here, Bitcoin value will always be cyclical. You don't really know if it's ever going to hit that kind of economic return that it makes sense to continue to mine. But I just feel like we're stuck in this infinite loop, just this current state of Bitcoin, that we haven't done a major improvement since 2021 or 2017. Like those are the two last improvements. And if we want Bitcoin to fundamentally be around 100 years from now, we can't stay in this limited state. And I know the perspective we're seeing is that we operate a Bitcoin wallet called Leather, and we primarily are served by folks creating ordinals or runes. So like that's the perspective I'm bringing. they can do collections on, you can do a collection under the four limit, like you can still make it, but it will never be as metadata or complexity rich like what you can do on another chain. But if you fundamentally believe that, let's say an art piece, or doesn't even have to be an art piece to be an ordinal, it can be any sort of inscription of data, should have the ability to be immutable, then increase the block space and just make people pay for it, because people are willing to pay for it. That's the funny thing. I think people are very much concerned that fees will rise, transaction fees, but let it be competitive.
Yeah, I think I'll take the other side for like the sake of the sake of the podcast, and I think there's like there's merits to all these different views, right? Like, I think even if you look at a lot of people that were on one side of the block size war, many people, have actually changed their mind as time has gone on. Like Matt from Thesis is a great example. He was like very pro big blocks, and then now is much more like in the small block camp. So I think all of that is a continuum. There's always, arguments, kind of for or against. I think my current view on this is mainly that full expensive Bitcoin blocks are good. And I think we have this security budget problem that we have to solve. And I see the argument for having more and more of this economic activity on the Bitcoin base layer. But I also think that much of this activity can be on L2s, or it can be on sidechains like Core Stacks. And I think that is how many of these things will likely evolve, is you have a expensive mint process on Bitcoin that is like max security, max decentralization, and probably max expense to a degree. And then a lot of the follow-on activity actually takes place off of Bitcoin L1. And I actually see that as a success case, because ultimately, like, a lot of Bitcoin season 2 is faster, cheaper, higher throughput, Bitcoin transactions on these, additional scaling solutions. And that to me is just further the separation of the Bitcoin asset from the Bitcoin rails. But you still have this really slow, expensive Bitcoin settlement layer. So I think it's really tough because there are these like competing views, and you're never going to get to full alignment on Bitcoin. But I think also, if we kind of go from a user experience perspective, ordinals minting, runes mint, like all that sort of stuff actually isn't that bad at this point. Like, you have wallets like Leather and groups that like have actually like tamed the beast, if you will, right? Like, they've made it much simpler and easier to use. I think when you take that to DeFi, it gets really clunky really fast. And I think that's where, if we want to have user experience that's competitive with many of these, EVM solutions that are out there, or just general Solana, et cetera, it'll have to be on different blockchains. You just won't be on Bitcoin L1.
I think that's a great point, because when you think about Bitcoin, you want something that's simple to use. But when I want to do complex activity on Bitcoin, it's not going to be on the L1. Like, that's the fundamental truth. Like, I'm going to have to use an L2, because Bitcoin doesn't have smart contracts. It doesn't have just the native functionality of what we need to create something that could be a new financial system or whatever it may be. You're kind of limited on the finiteness of 21 million and no smart contracts. So like, you're kind of fucked on that. Like, there's no other way to put it. But L2s that re-harness the hash power or security of Bitcoin, so you get that kind of immutability factor to the best of both worlds, is really where it's going to be. And so, I mean, it's no secret that I contribute to Stacks. Like, I am one of the core contributors to Stacks, as while working on a wallet and such. But that's, I think, where all of this L2 kind of season 2 movement has been, is everyone is in a rush to create their L2 to ultimately use the security of Bitcoin. But a lot of these L2s like really did it wrong, because they're building EVM. Like, let's not, like, do we even go into that? Like, the entire point of Bitcoin was to be using proof of work, because that was hard, concrete, and we know what the money going in and the security aspect of it. When you go the L2 route to use EVM, I feel like you've already lost the argument, because you're no longer using the beauty of Bitcoin, which is the Lindy effect for 15 years. And so anytime I look at L2s, whether it be Stacks or even other ones that we may integrate in Leather as a wallet, I actually look from that lens.
So I think, let me take the other side of that as well. So Core is EVM, and I think it's the fastest growing Bitcoin scaling solution from like an ecosystem perspective. I think the EVM has 10 years of institutional knowledge, network effects, tooling, And I think like virtual machines, many things can go multi-VM at some point as well. Like I don't think you're necessarily just fully locked in. Example, Stacks is also looking into WASM, right? Like not just Clarity. And again, developer adoption really matters. I think the proof of work EVM argument like is totally orthogonal. I don't think those are related. You could in theory have whatever VM you want there and still write data back to Bitcoin. There's some SVM Bitcoin L2s as an example, right?
I agree to your point. I think it's the runtimes to giving developers the comfort to code in a language that they know and they know well, just to bring the activity back. Like I totally agree. Partially why Stacks is doing WAS and looking at Rust. Maybe there will be a Solidity runtime in the future because like totally see developers know what they know and some are willing to learn new languages, but a lot are not. So I get that.
Totally. And I think it's all about meeting people where they're at today, right? Because it's really important. If we build, everything net new, but can't actually attract builders or TVL or transaction volume, that's not a success in my opinion. And I think there's one other kind of meta point that you mentioned, and this is something that both Core and Stacks do in different ways. Both are actually trying to add economic value to Bitcoin miners. They just do it in different ways. So with Core, again, we give part of our block reward to the 55% of the Bitcoin hash that's currently securing the network. That serves as this, exogenous block reward for Bitcoin. Stacks, with its Nakamoto upgrade, if I understand it correctly, will also write the state back to Bitcoin, which will also help on some level with transaction fees. And I think that's the other meta piece here, that there is like a Bitcoin alignment, if you will, with the Bitcoin main chain that is very critical. And I think that's part of the differentiation from like random Bitcoin L2s with wrapped Bitcoin versus these Bitcoin scaling solutions, right? There is actually a deeper economic tie. And this is also why Core introduced Bitcoin staking. And it's the first of its kind protocol where Bitcoin holders actually receive rewards from to secure the core chain, those same rewards that miners do. And with dual staking, you're actually incentivized to participate in both the core network and the Bitcoin network as a staker. And I think this is really like the long-term future is how do we build POS layers or DPoS layers in Core's case on top of Bitcoin? And it's a multifaceted problem. Some of it's yield, some of it's ecosystem. And I think it's being reality of what can we do to make the biggest impact to help move Bitcoin forward.
I tend to agree. I think users want more expressivity and miners need incentives sooner rather than later. And so it seems like there's a match here where this can be a win-win. But it might take some base layer changes in order to bring that about like the best way. And we spoke about base layer changes a bit. And so we actually had Tyler Whittle from Taproot Wizards come on the show and talk to us about OPCAT. OPCAT, is one of those base layer changes. Maybe there's more. We talked about block size a bit, which is, it wasn't as radical before, but maybe it's more radical than OPCAT in terms of base layer changes now. And everyone I talk to is pro OPCAT. Like I moderated a Bitcoin panel, everyone's pro OPCAT. Tyler Whittle explained the case. Like the one argument against it I've heard is that it brings MEV to Bitcoin, but ordinals and runes created MEV on Bitcoin anyway, and we didn't even need to make a change to the base layer. And so I'm curious from like, can either of you guys articulate an argument against OPCAT?
I don't actually have one because I think OPCAT, like honestly, is like quite sensible. There's only a very few set of commands that you can issue with OPCAT, and like what we like about it from like the Stacks side is that it gives us a little bit more functionality to continue to develop even more complex commands on the L2 side, but ultimately we can bridge back or tie back to the L1 commands. Like that's the true goal. Like any Bitcoin L2 ultimately wants to benefit the L1 or we wouldn't be in this game to start. And so I have no negative detractors per se on OPCAT.
So I think like I'm pro OPCAT generally, but I think the argument that people make is it's similar to like Taproot or something else where like we don't know what that complexity will eventually like kind of do to Bitcoin. But I don't think that's a bad thing. And I think that's like one of the big struggles in the Bitcoin community right now is with the ossifiers, right? And like there's always going to be that tension to ossify because like Bitcoin has $1 trillion plus today in assets. It's got, so much of that's in these major, ETF products. There's always going to be a tension. But I think if we get to a point where we can't change Bitcoin, that is also really dangerous, right? And maybe the time scales, get longer and longer. But I think some of these arguments into like, well, OPCAT will allow some sort of like crazy recursive DDoS that like destroys the network, whatever. Like I haven't found anything that is actually convincing me of that, right? Like, but I think there'll always be those arguments that will just be really challenging to kind of get through. My biggest issue with OPCAT is actually just the timeline. And it's like I have no idea what timeline that will take. Is that like I've heard optimistically it's like a year, worst case maybe like 5 years, but that's a fairly large like set of time where that can happen. And my biggest message to the L2s out there is, hey, how do we build stuff that isn't reliant upon these things that may or may not come in the future? It's my same thing that I talk about with BitVM. Core is super bullish on BitVM. Like we would love to create a BitVM bridge. It's just, when is it ready? When is it practical? And like until we get there, building or saying that you're using these things, I think is a little disingenuous, because I just don't think you're being reasonable or like operating on practical timescales. And I think at worst, it's deceptive, right? And it's just that balance is really tricky. But I think it's like, how do we push these things forward? And ultimately, that will probably take, to use, as a pun, like a bridge to the Bitcoin community, right? Like how do we actually get enough momentum to bring one of these things forward?
Welcome aboard on our journey into the singularity. This is the endgame roadmap for Frax and Fraxtal, the new L2 out of the Frax ecosystem that is totally based on fractal scaling. Fraxtal is a modular L2 blockchain built by Frax with modular and fractal scaling in mind. Fractal scaling is based on the Mandelbrot set of fractal images, and it explains how L2s become L3s and the entire app chain lifecycle goes through its evolution. The Frax ecosystem is made of some of the top builders in the space and has stemmed from its OG days of the Frax stablecoin. It is now in the LST space, the LRT space, and this Fraxtal L2 joins the existing suite of Frax products, including Frax Swap and Frax Lend. You can see Frax Ferry, the bridge to go from any chain, Arbitrum, Optimism, or mainnet into the Fraxtal mainnet. Bridge your tokens and bring your Frax assets into the Fraxtal ecosystem. Join today to get the best out of Fraxtal. You are still early. Join today, take part in our expedition into the singularity. Mantle is a layer 2 blockchain with one of the biggest on-chain treasuries in all of crypto, and they had a 100-day campaign called Metamorphosis live now. What this is it is a campaign for their liquid staked ETH token, METH, as well as their upcoming liquid restaking token, CMETH, where you can utilize this token on the Mantle network in a variety of different apps, some of your favorite restaking protocols and DeFi protocols, and earn yields in the form of powder, which will eventually be turning into a governance token. Mantle's been around for a while. We like them because they use their own form of EigenDA. They have a good ecosystem and they're growing. So check out this 100-day Metamorphosis campaign, and hope you guys enjoy the rest of this video.
I actually love that you brought up the ETF point, because I might be one of the really few who like absolutely hates that there's a spot ETF for Bitcoin. Like I understand for markets and all these things, but it breaks my heart that so much of Bitcoin is going to be locked in bank custody, staying in the black rocks, or like what the entire point of Bitcoin was to be money or an asset that is with you at all times, and you don't need a lock in custody. And so every time I see the inflows going into ETFs, I'm like, great, that's less free Bitcoin for people to use on-chain activity, whatever they want to do with it or not do with it. I just feel like if we kind of leave Bitcoin in the state that it is, the future of Bitcoin looks slightly bleak. That one, there will be less miners, but two, all the world's Bitcoin will be in some BlackRock, some custody and such. And like, that's partially why I'm like a little bit more bullish on the BitVMs or the OPCATs or some of these small tweaks, because I think that's the only way that Bitcoin stays out of 50% of supply is locked in custody. Like we already have like supply issues as is with so much Bitcoin just in cold storage, just across the board, that no one's willing to use or deploy their Bitcoin. But if we continue on this Bitcoin stays in this like very narrow set mindset, I don't really know what the vitality of like Bitcoin markets for activity and transactions will look like 100 years from now.
Yeah,
Yeah,
a lot to unpack there. So kind of starting from the jump, like the key thing that you guys were kind of going back and forth about with regards to like the EVM chains as well was about this kind of economic alignment back to the L1. And so I think that like tying in the ETF and this kind of centralization of custody coins, there's no economic value being redistributed back to miners, being distributed back to apps on Stacks, on Core, contributing to the security of the network as a network itself. And then kind of like the only pushback on OPCAT is that it's this time frame idea. And I put out a tweet that was like, I think that the Bitcoin scaling space is going to shock a lot of people, because I truly think that the amount of value that can be in these L2s and in these chains and on Bitcoin itself is exponentially higher than any other roll up or ecosystem or ecosystem of chains out there, Ethereum, Solana, L1s. But it's going to take longer than I think a lot of us expect or a lot of us hope for, which I think is so. I agree with you there, Rich. And I kind of want to bring this back to this ETF, to this kind of EVM conversation with regards to this recent WBTC happenings, where BitGo is now transferring its basically ownership of WBTC, and the whole process of managing it to a Justin Sun associated entity, of which MakerDAO has already taken away the ability to open up a CDP on Ethereum using WBTC. The governance proposal passed relatively quickly. And then just shortly after, Coinbase puts out a tweet that goes viral, millions of views, just CBBTC. And so like, how are we thinking about CBBTC, this WBTC shift? And the question for you guys is Stacks and Core, are those important? Do we need Stacks and Core in a world where all of the Bitcoin is just going to go onto CBBTC on base and it's going to be the biggest Bitcoin holder, Bitcoin L2? Like, how are you guys approaching this, and why is it still so important, that these solutions that you guys have built remain, rather than just kind of all this Bitcoin going into an Ethereum roll up or into some of these ETF providers?
So I'm happy to field this to start. Disclosure, I worked at Coinbase for a long time. I was super excited about CBBTC coming out. I think it's like natural business for them that they should have been in a very long time ago. Like sometimes you get so big that it just takes a long time to do like these obvious businesses, if that makes sense. And from what I've learned about CBBTC, it's an exciting product. And I think it's good to have rivalrous products when it comes to other centralized Bitcoin derivatives, right? Like WBTC has kind of been allowed to operate in isolation for a long time. We haven't seen a lot of credible Bitcoin fully custodied derivatives come on chain. And in terms of Core, we welcome all of these Bitcoin derivatives. Like it's one of the reasons that Core has 250 million plus in Bitcoin TVL. Some of it is, Core derivatives like Core BTC. Others are Solve BTC and some of these other groups. We welcome them all, and it's not going to be one Bitcoin derivative that sucks up $100 billion like anytime soon, right? It's going to be a diverse group of folks that build these different products. But that's where the devil lies in the details. And my guess is this is something that Rena will also be aligned with, is it's also important that we have decentralized Bitcoin derivatives. That is critical to the story of Bitcoin. And I probably talk to somewhere around $1 billion of Bitcoin every week, every other week, mostly in the context of Core's Bitcoin staking. But when we talk about Bitcoin staking or even Core BTC, the first question that comes up with real Bitcoin holders is, what are the trust assumptions? I know XYZ friend that lost a ton of money at BlockFi or Genesis or Celsius, and I'm just never doing that again. Like I have too many battle scars from those sorts of stories. And with so many of these conversations, like you start to learn more and more that unlike Ethereum, maybe Bitcoin really cares about trust assumptions. Like it's a very different ethos, because most Bitcoiners, like key drive in life is to earn more Bitcoin. Like that's it, right? And that's a very unique spot for many Ethereum folks, where they just want to earn more dollars, more Ethereum. Like it's just a different product. Like you're optimizing for different things. And that's also one of the reasons that, folks like Core need to exist. We need to have these opportunities for Bitcoin natives to go earn safe yields on their Bitcoin, to go enable these higher, faster, cheaper throughput use cases. And I don't think that will just be done with fully custodied stablecoins on Ethereum rollups. I think there's also one other piece, is we haven't seen the killer app yet of Bitcoin DeFi, but we will. And I think it will be done with decentralized Bitcoin derivatives, because ultimately that's how you're going to unlock the largest piece of that 21 million. It's not going to be just like a simple plain Jane, I think, thing that we've seen in other spots using custody stablecoins. Otherwise, WBTC would be a lot bigger than 9 billion.
Similar viewpoints. Look, WBTC has existed for years, yet only 1 to 2% is like bridged or wrapped in. Like, that's just the fundamental issue of no one wanted to trust a KYC'd Bitcoin. No one wanted to move their precious Bitcoin to accept another chain's risk, because you have smart contract risk. Like, no matter how you see it. With CB Bitcoin, what I welcome is that, look, they have all the infrastructure tools in place, whether it be getting to stable coins, access points, smart wallets, embedded wallets, everything under the sun to actually make using Bitcoin a viable category, which is awesome. I think anyone who's in Bitcoin has to be happy about that. Like, if you aren't, that's just like an asshole move to not be happy about that. But kind of going back to, how much trust will I use with Bitcoin with a single custodian or a single party? Like, that trust assumption is key. What I like about some of the other alternatives is that a decentralized signer or validator set is critical, that is open, that anyone can use. There has been others who have kind of attempted this through federated models, but you cannot enter, like, there is no means to enter the federated model unless you are a federated entity or a party that can participate. And that fundamentally goes against the ethos of Bitcoin, that anybody should be able to mine or participate in such. And so Stacks obviously is launching their asset towards the end of the year called SBTC, that is using a open decentralized signer set to validate Bitcoin. It will be alongside the CB Bitcoins or the WBTCs in the world. But I think the most important aspect is, will people use this in DeFi related activity? Kind of to Rich's point, no one wants to get wrecked by BlockFi or Celsius again. So will a open source, known decentralized validator set be a step in the right direction, as opposed to, trust me, bro, I'm a custodian, or trust me, bro, I'm Coinbase? Like, I think there has to be that distinction of, some of these entities are almost too big. So do you want to give an alternative approach a try?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to look at Ethereum. Like, there's Lido Stake ETH has a strong dominance, and that's more of like the decentralized kind of like crypto native, if you will. And then like Coinbase ETH, CB ETH is like shortly right behind it. So I think it's like a spectrum of people that will like want to choose both. But I imagine Rich in this in this Bitcoin's DeFi killer app, it's probably going to be some sort of like CDP market with some like intricate yield designs, and perhaps some sort of way to really get a lot of efficiency for your BTC. I think that they'll be the two biggest deposits in this will be a decentralized version. So Stacks.btc, CoreDAO, one of these, and then CBBTC will probably be right there. And I think different spectrums of people will have a kind of different risk tolerance or taste. But I think generally what you guys are more so getting at is that the Bitcoin community specifically is not just going to be okay with Coinbase BTC. Like, it's similar in the sense that like the Ethereum community shouldn't just be okay with USDC and USDT. You know, we have DAI, we have others. And so that's kind of like where we're trending towards.
I think it's like as simple as thinking of, look, one of the core kind of premises of Bitcoin DeFi is I should be able to get liquidity out for my Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is a great like asset to use as collateral. Am I going to wrap it into WBTC and then go on Aave and take out a loan? Or am I going to wrap it into, or bridge it into, a non-custodial kind of Bitcoin derivative asset and then take liquidity against my loan? Like, I think there's like two other ways to look at it. And then like one that has always stood out to me on the WBTC thing is, I believe there is a tax consequence for it. So like, because it is a wrapper, like you have to go through a wrapping, there is a tax event. Whereas when you use some of the other assets like SBTC or Core's BTC, because it is a locking mechanism and then you're going to withdraw it, I believe that stays as a tax minimized event for, let's say, Americans.
So I believe Rena is correct in the tax consequences, but I do not play a tax professional, so do not take
definitely don't take financial advice from us, but like at least from like the moving from one to an,
Totally agree, but I think that actually really does matter to Bitcoiners. I'm making a joke about the tax piece, but I actually do think that's really relevant because people are sitting on bags from 2012, right? And if you're going to wrap it and it's going to cost you the cap gains on that, that's crazy, right? Like that
Why
actually
bother?
really is important. 100, well, it's net negative, right? Like it's
Yeah,
actually
that's
a
a
really
really interesting
nasty
point.
scenario.
Yeah.
And then I think on top of that, I think the STE point is really, really critical here. And Core has its own LST/BTC coming out. And then there's a bunch of LSTs getting built on top of Core's yield. And I think this is what we've seen is yield is actually the killer app, but it needs to be safe and it needs to be secure. It needs to be decentralized. It needs to be non-custodial. And this is part of the missing ingredient from Bitcoin DeFi today is we have a lack of actual sustainable trustless yield sources. And I think that's what will really help unlock a bunch of these Bitcoin DeFi use cases. And I don't think CBBTC, at least to start, will have a yield bearing aspect. And I think over time, maybe they'll add it. Like you'll get into these other scenarios over time, but it opens up the opportunity for many of these LSTs to actually grow and get a bunch of market share to eventually get to some of these yield stacking components that we all would love to get to as long as it's safe. Like you mentioned the CDP protocol. I can't think of a better CDP protocol than one that would take LSTs. So you get to have, trustless yield, and that is an additional booster on top of the leverage you're getting from the stable coins while maintaining your upside exposure to Bitcoin. That's kind of like the killer trio. And this is
Yeah, and it's like Rich, for you, it's like the perfect type of product, right? You have a bunch of Bitcoin, or like that's what you like denominate your net worth in, right? So it's like being able to borrow against that is like sorry to interrupt, but that just seems like if you have a yield bearing asset that you can borrow against, that just seems like Bitcoin's biggest unlock for the coming 18 months.
Totally. And so there's several CDP products that are close to launching on Core, hopefully in the next month or so. So we're really excited about this. I've been trying to get CDP protocols, like begging on podcasts for I don't know, 9 months, 12 months. It's been a really long time, and people laugh at me when I say it. And I think the reason that it hasn't been popular is many of these folks haven't been in Bitcoin for a long time and don't realize that this is the killer use case of Bitcoin. It's really simple. It doesn't need to be over-engineered and complex. The other piece that I think turns off some folks, and again, Core is trying to find people when it becomes the ecosystem as much as we can be, who are really aligned with the long-term vision of Core. But it's finding people who want to build real businesses. And what I mean by that is CDP protocol might not need its own native token for a long time, right? It can actually just generate tons of fees. And those are interesting kind of things for people to think through because so much of the meta in crypto has been when token, right? And it's that leads to these bad incentives where the TVL or AUM game really in Bitcoin is a much longer time frame. It's probably 5+ years, but one of these CDPs is going to get $10 billion in AUM, and it's going to be this fee generating machine because it's giving so much utility to Bitcoin holders. And I know that's something that probably Rena struggles with as well when you're trying to work with teams. It's finding folks that really see the opportunity in Bitcoin beyond just the TAM of what Bitcoin's worth today, because you need to see on a longer time scale how it can grow and how much utility you can actually bring.
I tend to agree with you guys that the yield is the killer app and Bitcoin is the best collateral asset in the world. But do you think the ETF issuers that custody all of this Bitcoin now are going to collateralize it on chain and take the smart contract risk to generate that yield? Rena's shaking her head. It just seems more likely that they engage in some off-chain agreement to if they're going to generate any kind of yield, they do it off chain with their other counterparties in a legal document.
Yeah, it's going to be the same as the earn fiascos or things like that. I don't fundamentally think they are going to get it right. Whereas builders in Stacks and Core and whomever are actually trying to build just a better way to do this transparent on chain. Things that I would love to see kind of coming in is I don't think a lot of Bitcoin related products or protocols need a token too. I'm actually with Rich on this one. I actually think creating a sustainable business with Bitcoin is more important to the vitality of Bitcoin than when token, when this, when that. So actually is I see a lot of this dissent in the BRC20 or Runes community that they rush to create these assets because they have, let's say Bitcoin denominations or Bitcoin backed, yet they can't sustain their business whatsoever because they're wholly dependent on price goes up. And like, that is the wrong mentality for anyone who's operating this space of, it shouldn't be, can I build something that generates, that is dependent on markets? It should be, can I build a business that actually can sustain itself? And so like, Rich is spot on this. Like CDP protocols are like one really amazing way to do this. Like we've seen this play out in like Athena on the ETH side and such. And like, why isn't this kind of a core premise of Bitcoin is beyond me.
I'll say just one quick thing on Robbie's point around yield is I do not think that these ETF issuers will come on chain. And I think that's a very good thing. Do not get me wrong. I think what they'll use is non-custodial staking protocols like Core, right? Where you don't have to come on chain. And I think that's a fine stopping point. And that's why there's actually, these yield-bearing ETPs that are currently powered by Core's yield in Europe and will come to the Middle East and Asia, later this year, because you don't need to make that choice. But I think yield-bearing Bitcoin inside of these custodied solutions, particularly ETFs, will be a very big use case.
One like loose thought that I've had like in the back of my mind is with so much Bitcoin going into custody, do you guys actually think Bitcoin that's liquid, whether it's on chain, whether on like BTC just like held in your own wallet or BTC bridged into, let's say, an L2, will trade at a premium because it's free, liquid, and available? Like it's something I've wondered of, is there a market to have a slight premium of on-chain Bitcoin versus custodied Bitcoin?
I think it'll probably offset, like, because there is, depending on the L2 that it's locked in, you can relate that to like smart contract risk. And so again, like related back to like the staked ETH thing, a lot of times it was trading at a discount or a premium, depending on the smart contract risk, or if it was on peg or off peg. And so I think like, yes, it may be a premium because it is liquid, but you are taking smart contract risk, which is going to dilute that premium kind of
Might
back
be
to
at a
par.
Discount. It's typically
Could be
been
at a discount,
discount.
could be at a premium. Depends how you price the risk and how the market prices the liquidity of the Bitcoin.
Yeah, it's something I'm always thinking about because I know BlackRock is about to be the biggest bag holder of all.
Yeah, they're on pace
I think eventually we'll
to
get
exceed
redemptions.
Satoshi's coins like by the end of the year or next year, maybe. Rich,
But yeah,
do you
Rich
have-
is right.
The end of next year. But they'll add redemptions at some point, and that's like much needed. Like, don't get me wrong. Like I think for like the centralization risk of Bitcoin, if we can't eventually get them to add redemptions, it is just a one-way black hole, to Rena's point, right? Like it will only grow. And that is, that is an existential threat.
Look, maybe this is a necessary evil that we have to take as a stepping stone for like more municipalities and like governments and country national like treasuries in order, like first it goes through the ETFs, then the US government, like then every country in the world has whatever you call it, war chest in Bitcoin reserve, right? Bitcoin reserve. Is that any different? If it's governed by...
That was always the dream too, but like the way that we're kind of understanding it now from your perspective is like, that's also paradoxical. Like that's also not the ideal. Basically, we need them to be all on chain. Basically.
We need them to be degenerate. They need to like GM and be an enjoyer just like the rest of us.
Covalent is solving the long-term data availability problem where a lot of the data availability providers today in the modular space, when you post data to them, they actually only hold that data for about 12 to 16 days. And then it's basically, they can go into an archive node, or oftentimes it's just kind of put away into the abyss. And what Covalent's trying to do is build this long-term data availability solution, which can plug into some of these modular data availability providers and provide this longer-term perpetual data solution. So what we try to think of this as is when you post transaction data onto Celestio or Veil or any of these modular DA solutions or even Ethereum, Covalent is able to provide a long-term data storage and data availability platform for that data after the time period. Blockchains are billboards, not databases, and we need these providers in the space to be able to kind of hold on to the long-term data that is provided from these providers and these blockchain state. This is where Covalent comes in. They just had a nice rebrand. Check them out on Twitter as well as the website. Thank you for being here. Hope you enjoy the rest of the show. Everclear is pioneering the clearing layer. The clearing layer can almost be thought of as splitwise when you go on a trip with friends, but for the blockchain. What I mean by that is when users are sending cross-chain messages, there's oftentimes fillers and solvers who have balances left on different chains that they need to rebalance and reset their positions. This is where Everclear comes in. Everclear is pioneering a collaborative approach to the chain abstraction future, and they are willing to work with interoperability partners, solvers, and other providers in the space to build a interoperable and chain abstraction future. Check out Everclear at everclear.org, and welcome back to the roll-up.
I was just going to say, I really hope that ETFs don't become the killer app for Bitcoin. Right? Like,
oh God!
I think there is like,
then we all can leave the industry. There's no hope.
I think one last thing to mention, then we'll wrap up here. We got to bounce is that you guys mentioned about the way that some of the builders are approaching like the core and Stacks ecosystem, as well as just like Bitcoin scaling in general with regards to tokens. I think like the one really big advantage from the mindset and kind of community perspective that Bitcoin has is that some of the OGs are like kind of anti-altcoins, kind of like anti-altcoins. And like there's this like meme around, none of this is needed, which I kind of find foolish in a sense, because I think Ethereum is extremely provable experiment that's gone very well and that has kind of fostered innovation. It just goes down the line. Surely there's a lot of shit coins, but I think keeping that culture within the space of building actual sustainable businesses and applications that aren't just like here to kind of like pump tokens out is going to be something that's going to keep the culture and community of those applications actually reach real product market fit, and the innovation cycles will be less kind of slowed down, because in Ethereum, the innovation cycles are always like funding apps for tokens. And I think that'll still happen, but it should, if this is the way that you guys are approaching and that you're influencing your communities, then that idea should be able to permeate into builders and have actual ideas be built based on real, forecasting of revenue and real kind of product market fit, and less just for the sake of kind of launching tokens and things. And so I think that mental model, while dangerous to Bitcoin in the early days, because ultimately Bitcoiners were wrong about that, and they'll still continue to be wrong about kind of like needing other networks. I think keeping that part of that inside of the Bitcoin scaling solutions is going to be super important for the actual use and sustainability of Stacks, Core, and these other chains. So just wanted to throw that in there. And it's been a great pod.
Awesome. But yeah, I think I echo your thoughts, Andy, is the idea of like these projects just being token factories and like the whole business of Web3 being launch token, and to Rena's earlier point of like when go up being your business model. Hopefully that dies, right? Like that is like the worst part of the Web3 space. And people need to be thinking about cash flows, transaction fees. Like you should be able to run a model and say, hey, if this network grows 10x, 5x, whatever that is, what does this actually look like from a business? Because I think we've all seen over like the last several cycles that if you don't have longer term plans, you just burn out, right? Like you fly too close to the sun, there's nothing there, it's not sustainable. And I think it's like a healthy culling of the herd in some ways, right? Where it's either you want to participate or not. And like some of the conversations that I have, it's funny because people will mention, they'll be like, well, Core is a multi-cycle project or Stacks is a multi-cycle project. And you're like, that's such a terrible way to look at things, where like the expectation of your business is like under 4 years. Like, what is that? Right? Like, it's just totally crazy to me. And I think that's where like the other thing that we're seeing in Bitcoin space and the Ethereum space as well is this wave of builders has done things previously. And sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. But when you bring some of the institutional knowledge of 10 plus years of operating or whatever, you realize that these time horizons are a lot longer and the incentives really matter. So I think you characterized it really well, and hopefully that when token viewpoint slowly dissipates.
I mean, at the end of the day, tokens have to have utility. Bitcoin has utility. ETH has utility. Like that's one way. Otherwise, it's just gas, bro. Like that's otherwise what a token should be used for. I'm sorry.
Coming from a petroleum engineer, wouldn't expect anything less. Thank you so much, guys. It's been a pleasure, and rock on. Great work in the Bitcoin space. Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks.
Cheers.